The Appalachian Mountains of 1978 were a world apart from modern America, a region where old traditions ran deep, where neighbors might live miles apart, and where misunderstandings could fester in isolation. This dramatization explores how fear, miscommunication, and cultural divides transformed a simple road dispute into a community tragedy that would haunt the region for decades. This dramatization is based on real events, but some details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. The purpose is educational, showing how seemingly minor conflicts can escalate when dialogue and understanding are abandoned. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. The morning mist clung to the hollows of eastern Kentucky like a shroud, thick enough that Martha Holloway could barely see the old oak tree that marked the edge of their property. She stood on the porch of the weathered cabin, her calloused hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug filled with coffee so strong it could wake the dead. At 62, Martha had lived through enough Appalachian winters to know that the early October fog meant a harsh season was coming. "Boys still ain't back from checking the fence line," she murmured to her husband, Clayton, who sat whittling on the porch step. His thick fingers worked the knife with practiced ease, shaving curls of pine that fell like snow around his boots. Clayton Holloway was a man of few words, carved from the same stubborn stone as the mountains themselves. At 67, his hair had gone white as creek foam, but his shoulders remained broad from decades of hard labor. He'd inherited this land from his father, who'd inherited it from his father before him. The Holloways had been in these mountains since before the Civil War, when their ancestor had claimed this remote parcel and declared it home. "They'll be along," Clayton said, without looking up from his carving. "Road's been getting more traffic lately. Probably just making sure nobody's been messing with our gates." The road Clayton mentioned was little more than a dirt track that cut through their property, connecting State Route 15 to a smaller county road that led to the next valley over. For generations, it had been used occasionally by locals who knew to ask permission, or by the rare hunter who understood mountain courtesy. But lately, strangers had been using it as a shortcut, treating the Holloway land like public property. Martha took a long sip of her coffee and watched the fog slowly lift from the hollow. The liquid was bitter and hot, warming her from the inside out as she contemplated the changes that had been creeping into their isolated world. "I heard from Ethel Carson yesterday. She said more folks been coming through Millfield asking about shortcuts to the interstate. Tourism people, she thinks." Clayton's knife paused mid-cut. Tourism was a word that sat bitter on his tongue. The outside world had been creeping into Appalachia for years now, bringing with it ideas and attitudes that didn't fit with the old ways. City folk who thought mountain people were curiosities to be gawked at or obstacles to be pushed aside in the name of progress. "Tourists," he spat, resuming his whittling with more force than necessary. The pine shavings fell faster now, accumulating in small piles around his work boots. "Don't know the first thing about respect." Martha nodded grimly. She'd seen the way outsiders looked at them when they went to town, like they were relics from another century. Quaint, but ultimately disposable. The condescension in their voices when they asked for directions, the way they assumed mountain folk were too simple to understand modern ways, it made her blood boil. The sound of boots on gravel announced the return of his sons. Thomas and Jesse Holloway emerged from the morning mist like ghosts, their faces grim beneath the brims of their worn baseball caps. Both boys, though at 38 and 35 they were hardly boys anymore, had inherited their father's imposing build and their mother's sharp green eyes. Thomas, the elder, was the talker of the two. He'd been born with a gift for words that could charm a snake or start a fight, depending on his mood. As a child, he'd been the one to negotiate with angry teachers when Jesse got into scrapes at school, the one to sweet-talk their way out of trouble when their boyhood adventures went too far. But there was steel beneath his smooth manner, a core of mountain pride that wouldn't bend for anyone. Jesse was quieter, more like his father, but there was an intensity to him that made people nervous. He'd come back from Vietnam different, though nobody in the family talked about it much. The boy who'd left for Southeast Asia had been eager and full of dreams. The man who'd returned carried shadows in his eyes, and jumped at sudden noises. He'd been home for 6 years now, but some part of him was still fighting a war that wouldn't end. "Found fresh tire tracks by the lower gate," Thomas announced, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. The brown stream left a dark stain in the dust, emphasizing his disgust. "Looks like somebody drove right through our fence, broke the chain, left the gate hanging open like they owned the place." Martha felt a familiar knot of anger tighten in her chest. That gate had been installed by Clayton's father back in the 1940s, a sturdy barrier designed to keep livestock in and unwanted visitors out. The chain that secured it was thick and strong, not something that would break by accident. Someone had deliberately destroyed their property. "Any idea who?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Had to be one of them cars from yesterday," Jesse said, his voice carrying the flat tone that meant trouble. When Jesse used that voice, it meant he was fighting to keep his temper under control, struggling against emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "That fancy sedan with the Tennessee plates. Driver didn't even slow down when I tried to wave him over." Clayton stood up slowly, his joints creaking like old floorboards. At his full height, he was an imposing figure, 6'3" and still strong despite his years. His presence filled the porch, radiating the quiet authority that came from a lifetime of hard-won respect. "What did you tell him?" "Told him this was private property," Thomas replied, his jaw tightening at the memory. "Said he needed to turn around and go back the way he came. Explained it real polite-like, even though I wanted to drag him out of that car and teach him some manners. But he just looked at me like I was speaking Chinese and kept on driving. Had his window rolled up the whole time, air conditioning running, acting like he couldn't hear a word I was saying." The image struck Martha like a physical blow. Her son, a grown man with children of his own, reduced to standing in the dust while a stranger dismissed him as irrelevant. The disrespect was almost more than she could bear. Jesse's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Man in the passenger seat was laughing. Actually laughing like it was some kind of joke that we cared about our own land. Had a camera too, taking pictures of us like we were animals in a zoo. The Holloway family had dealt with occasional trespassers before, but never with such blatant disrespect. In the mountain culture, property lines were sacred, and asking permission was more than courtesy. It was a fundamental sign of respect between neighbors. The fact that outsiders were now treating their land like a public highway felt like an assault on everything they'd been raised to believe. "It's getting worse," Martha said, settling into her rocking chair with a heavy sigh. The chair had been a wedding gift from Clayton's mother, carved from local walnut and worn smooth by decades of use. She'd rocked all 3 of her children to sleep in this chair, had watched countless sunrises and storms from this exact spot. It was her throne, her place of comfort and contemplation. Last month it was just 1 or 2 cars a week. Now it's near every day. They're not just passing through anymore. They're bringing friends, telling people about our road like it's some kind of discovery. Thomas pulled off his cap and ran his fingers through his dark hair, a gesture that reminded Martha painfully of his father at the same age. "I talked to Jimmy Patterson over at the general store. He says folks been coming in asking about scenic routes and authentic mountain experiences. Seems like somebody's been spreading the word about our road, maybe even putting it on some kind of unofficial map." Clayton walked to the edge of the porch and looked down the dirt track that disappeared into the trees. The road had been carved by his grandfather's hands, maintained by 3 generations of Holloway sweat. Every stone had been placed, every rut filled, every washout repaired by his family. It wasn't just a road to them, it was a piece of their heritage, as much a part of the family as the children they'd raised. The track wound through some of the most beautiful country in eastern Kentucky, following the natural contours of the mountains and crossing 3 separate creek beds. In spring, it was lined with dogwood and redbud, a tunnel of white and pink blossoms that took your breath away. In fall, like now, the maples and oaks created a canopy of red and gold that city folk would pay good money to see. But beauty came with responsibility, and maintaining that road was backbreaking work that the Holloways had never asked anyone else to share. "State's got no right to put us on their tourist maps," he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation and growing anger. "This ain't public land. Never has been, never will be. My great-grandfather filed the deed himself. Walked all the way to the county seat to make sure everything was legal and proper. Jesse kicked at a loose rock, his face clouded with frustration and something darker. Problem is, they don't care what we think. To them, we're just hillbillies standing in the way of convenience. They see our land and think it's wasted on us, like we don't deserve to have something nice because we didn't go to college or wear fancy clothes. The word hillbillies hung in the air like smoke from a coal fire. It was a term that outsiders threw around casually, not understanding how it cut to the bone. To the Holloways, being called hillbillies meant being dismissed as ignorant, backward, less than human. It was a way of saying that their way of life didn't matter, that their rights were negotiable, that their generations of hard work and sacrifice counted for nothing in the modern world. Thomas pulled off his cap and ran his fingers through his dark hair. "Daddy, maybe we should put up better signs. Make it clear this is private property, that folks need to ask before coming through. Something big enough that even city folk can't miss it." Clayton considered this for a moment. The family had always relied on common courtesy and mutual respect rather than formal barriers. In the old days, strangers were rare enough that you could deal with them individually, person to person. But the world was changing faster than an old man could adapt. "Signs might help with the decent folks," Martha said thoughtfully, rocking slowly as she spoke. "But the ones who are already ignoring us aren't likely to be stopped by a piece of wood and some paint. Seems to me that people who don't respect basic courtesy aren't going to be impressed by anything we put up." Jesse's jaw tightened, and Martha saw a familiar darkness flicker across his features. Since coming back from Southeast Asia, Jesse had struggled with what the doctors called readjustment issues. He had nightmares that left him walking the property at all hours, and he reacted poorly to unexpected noises or sudden movements. The constant trespassing was wearing on all of them, but for Jesse it felt like another kind of invasion, another violation of the safety he'd fought so hard to preserve. "Then maybe we need to make ourselves clearer in other ways," Jesse said, his voice carrying an edge that made the hair on Martha's arms stand up. There was something in his tone that made Martha look up sharply. She'd heard that voice before, usually right before Jesse disappeared into the woods for hours at a time, coming back exhausted and hollow-eyed. It was the voice he used when the memories got too strong, when the past and present blurred together in ways that frightened them all. "Now, son," Clayton said carefully, his parental instincts recognizing danger even if he couldn't articulate what kind. "We don't want to do anything we can't take back. This is still America, and people still have rights, even when they don't respect ours." Jesse nodded, but his hands remained clenched at his sides. "I'm just saying that maybe if people understood there were consequences for disrespecting our property, they'd think twice before doing it. Back in the service, we had ways of making sure people understood when they'd crossed a line." The fog had almost completely lifted now, revealing the full scope of the Holloway land. 500 acres of mountains, valleys, and streams that had sustained 4 generations of the family. It wasn't rich land by outside standards, too rocky for large-scale farming, too remote for easy development, but it was theirs. In a world that seemed to be changing faster than they could understand, their land was the one constant they could count on. From where they sat, they could see the apple orchard that Clayton's father had planted, the barn where they'd stored hay for decades of hard winters, the cemetery where 3 generations of Holloways rested beneath simple stone markers. This wasn't just property to them, it was home in the deepest sense of the word, a place where their family's story was written in every tree and stream. "I'll drive down to town this afternoon," Thomas said, trying to inject a note of reason into the conversation. "Talk to Sheriff Brennan, see what he says about the legal side of things. Maybe there's something we can do officially, some kind of injunction or restraining order." Clayton nodded approvingly. Thomas had always been the one to handle dealings with outsiders, having inherited his mother's diplomatic nature, along with his father's stubbornness. "Good idea. Maybe the law can help us sort this out before it gets any worse." But even as he spoke, Clayton felt a growing certainty that the law wouldn't be enough. In his experience, once outsiders decided they wanted something that belonged to mountain people, they usually found a way to take it. The coal companies had done it for decades, using legal tricks and political connections to strip away mineral rights that families had owned for generations. Now it seemed like the tourists wanted to do the same thing, claiming public access to private land simply because it was convenient for them. Martha stood up from her rocking chair and walked to the porch railing, her coffee mug warm in her hands. "You know what bothers me most," she said quietly. "It's not just that they're trespassing. It's that they look at us like we don't matter, like our feelings don't count because we're just ignorant mountain folk. They've decided that their convenience is more important than our rights, and they don't even try to hide it." The pain in her voice was raw and real. Martha Holloway had spent her entire life being proud of her heritage, proud of the strength and independence that mountain living required. She'd raised 3 children to understand that their way of life was valuable, that the lessons learned in these mountains, self-reliance, respect for the land, loyalty to family, were worth preserving. To see that way of life dismissed so casually by strangers felt like a betrayal of everything she'd tried to teach. Jesse looked up at his mother, and for a moment his face was that of the little boy she remembered, the child who'd come running to her whenever the world seemed too big and scary to handle alone. "Mama, what if talking doesn't work? What if the sheriff can't help us and the signs don't stop them, and they just keep coming anyway?" It was a question that none of them wanted to answer, but it hung in the morning air like the lingering fog. What happened when reasonable people reached the end of reason? What did you do when polite requests and legal channels failed to protect what mattered most? As the family went about their morning chores, none of them noticed the small rental car that had pulled off State Route 15 about a mile away. Inside, a young couple from Nashville was consulting a hand-drawn map they'd gotten from a gas station attendant in town. The map showed what looked like a convenient shortcut through the mountains, a way to shave an hour off their drive to Virginia. "Are you sure about this?" the woman asked, looking doubtfully at the narrow dirt road that disappeared into the trees. Something about the isolation of the place made her uneasy, though she couldn't put her finger on exactly why. Her boyfriend checked his watch impatiently. "The guy at the gas station said locals use it all the time. We're already running late, and this will get us there way faster than going around. Besides, it's not like we're hurting anything, it's just a road." Neither of them saw the hand-painted sign that read, "Private Property, Holloway Family Land," because it was partially hidden behind overgrown brush. Neither of them understood that they were about to drive into a situation that had been building tension for months. And neither of them realized that their decision to take a simple shortcut was about to set in motion a chain of events that would change everything for everyone involved. The car turned onto the dirt road and disappeared into the morning shadows, carrying its unsuspecting passengers toward a confrontation that nobody wanted, but that seemed increasingly inevitable. Behind them, the main highway continued its steady flow of traffic, oblivious to the small drama unfolding in the forgotten corners of Appalachia. In the distance, a crow cawed once and fell silent, as if sensing that something in the mountain air had shifted, that the careful balance between past and present was about to be tested in ways that none of them were prepared for. The rental car bounced along the dirt road, its low-slung chassis scraping against rocks that had been worn smooth by decades of mountain weather. Behind the wheel, David Mitchell gripped the steering wheel tighter with each pothole, his knuckles white with tension. Beside him, his girlfriend Sarah Chen checked the map for the 3rd time in 5 minutes, her designer sunglasses sliding down her nose as the car lurched through another deep rut. "This can't be right," Sarah muttered, her voice tight with growing anxiety. "This road looks like it hasn't been maintained since the Civil War. Are you sure that gas station guy knew what he was talking about?" David forced a smile, though his own confidence was beginning to waver. "Hey, trust me, I've done plenty of backcountry driving. This is just authentic mountain roads, probably been here for generations. We'll be through in 20 minutes tops." Both of them were in their late 20s, young professionals from Nashville who'd met at a marketing firm downtown. This weekend trip to Virginia was supposed to be romantic, a chance to get away from the city, see some fall foliage, maybe do some antiquing in small towns along the way. David worked in digital advertising and prided himself on being adaptable, resourceful. Sarah was a graphic designer with an eye for authenticity, someone who appreciated the real experiences that social media couldn't capture. What neither of them understood was that they were driving through someone's backyard, past fields that had been planted and harvested by the same family for 4 generations. alongside streams where Holloway children had learned to fish and swim. To them it was just scenery, pretty but essentially empty, a picturesque backdrop for their weekend getaway. "Look at this place," Sarah said, lowering her camera phone to snap pictures through the passenger window. "It's like stepping back in time. No cell towers, no strip malls, just pure mountain wilderness." But it wasn't wilderness at all. Every cleared field had been hand-cut from forest, every fence post driven into rocky soil by human hands. The road they were driving had been carved by men with hand tools and mules, maintained by families who understood that access came with responsibility. To call it wilderness was to erase the generations of human effort that had shaped every acre. The morning sun was climbing higher now, burning off the last of the fog and revealing the full beauty of the Appalachian landscape. Maples blazed red and orange against the darker green of pines, while the mountains rolled away in every direction like a rumpled blanket. It was the kind of view that people drove hundreds of miles to see, the kind of natural splendor that appeared on tourism brochures and coffee table books. "This is exactly what we needed," David said, his earlier nervousness forgotten in the face of such stunning scenery. "A real adventure, something we can't get in the city. I bet half our friends have never even seen country like this." Sarah nodded, already composing Instagram captions in her head. Her followers loved authentic content, real experiences that felt genuine rather than manufactured. This drive through untouched Appalachia would be perfect for her brand. She could almost see the likes accumulating already. Meanwhile, back at the Holloway cabin, Thomas was preparing for his trip to town. He'd changed into his best flannel shirt and newest jeans, the closest thing to formal wear that his wardrobe contained. Dealing with law enforcement required a certain level of respect, even when you were the one asking for help. He'd learned long ago that mountain people had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously by officials who often shared the outside world's prejudices. "You want me to come with you?" Jesse asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Thomas shook his head. "Better if I go alone. You know how you get around authority figures these days." It wasn't said unkindly, but both brothers understood the truth in it. Jesse's experiences in Vietnam had left him with a deep distrust of anyone in uniform, anyone who represented government authority. What he'd seen overseas had shattered his faith in the idea that officials always acted in the best interests of the people they served. Clayton emerged from the barn, a coil of new chain in his weathered hands. "Found this in the storage room. Should be strong enough to replace what got broken." He hefted the chain, testing its weight. "Course, if folks are determined to tear through our gates, they'll find a way. But at least it'll make them work for it." Martha watched her husband with concern. At 67, Clayton shouldn't have to be worrying about protecting his own land from casual vandalism. He'd spent his whole life working these mountains, building something solid and lasting for his family. The idea that strangers could simply ignore his efforts, treat his property like public access, was eating at him in ways that worried her deeply. "Maybe we should consider what Jesse suggested earlier," she said quietly, keeping her voice low so her younger son wouldn't hear. "Not violence, but something to make people think twice, a show of strength." Clayton looked at his wife with surprise. Martha had always been the peacemaker in the family, the one who urged caution and diplomacy over confrontation. For her to suggest taking a harder line meant that the situation was affecting her more deeply than he'd realized. "What did you have in mind?" he asked. "I don't rightly know," Martha admitted, "but I'm tired of feeling helpless in my own home. Tired of watching my boys get disrespected by people who wouldn't last a day trying to live the way we do. Maybe it's time to remind folks that mountain people aren't pushovers." Down the road, David and Sarah's rental car was approaching the heart of Holloway territory. They'd been driving for 15 minutes now, and while the scenery remained spectacular, Sarah was beginning to have second thoughts about their route choice. "David, I'm getting a weird feeling about this," she said, lowering her camera. "Look around, we haven't seen a single house or even a mailbox for the last 10 minutes. What if this isn't actually a public road?" David glanced around, taking in the landscape with new eyes. She was right. There were none of the usual signs of public access. No telephone poles, no road signs, no evidence of state maintenance. Just a dirt track winding through what was clearly private property. "I'm sure it's fine," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The guy at the gas station wouldn't have sent us somewhere we weren't supposed to be. But even as he spoke, David was beginning to remember the conversation differently. Had the attendant actually said it was a public road, or had he just pointed them toward a shortcut without specifying who owned it? The distinction seemed much more important now than it had an hour ago. The road curved sharply to the right, following the contour of the mountain, and suddenly they found themselves approaching a cluster of buildings that looked like something from another era. A cabin with a tin roof and stone chimney, a weathered barn, several smaller outbuildings arranged around a central yard. Chickens pecked at the ground near a vegetable garden, and smoke drifted lazily from the cabin's chimney. "Oh, wow," Sarah whispered, raising her camera instinctively. "This is like a living history museum. Look at how authentic everything is." But David had spotted something that made his stomach clench with anxiety. 3 men had emerged from the cabin, and they were looking at the approaching car with expressions that were anything but welcoming. Even from a distance, he could sense the tension in their posture, the way they'd positioned themselves to block the road. "Sarah, put the camera down," he said urgently. "I don't think they want their picture taken." Clayton, Jesse, and Martha stood in the dusty yard, watching the rental car approach with a mixture of anger and resignation. This was exactly what they'd been talking about. Strangers treating their home like a tourist attraction, pointing cameras at their private lives without permission or consideration. "Tennessee plates," Jesse observed, his voice flat and dangerous. "Same as yesterday." Martha felt her jaw clench. "Different car, though. Looks like word's really getting around about our road." Clayton stepped forward, his imposing frame casting a long shadow across the dirt track. He'd handled situations like this before, but never with quite this level of frustration building inside him. The repeated violations of their privacy were wearing thin his legendary patience. David brought the car to a stop about 20 feet from the family, close enough to talk, but far enough to make a quick escape if necessary. He rolled down his window and attempted his most diplomatic smile, the expression he used with difficult clients back in Nashville. "Good morning," he called out, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "Beautiful day, isn't it? We're just passing through on our way to Virginia." Clayton didn't respond immediately. He studied the young couple with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read strangers quickly and accurately. City people, obviously. Well-dressed, well-fed, driving a car that probably cost more than most mountain families made in a year. The kind of people who thought money solved all problems and courtesy was optional. "This is private property," Clayton said finally, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "Has been for over 100 years. You're trespassing." David's smile faltered slightly, but he pressed on. "I understand your concern, sir, but we were told this was a public shortcut. The attendant at the gas station in town specifically recommended this route. We're not trying to cause any trouble." Jesse stepped forward, his hands clenched at his sides. The sight of the camera in Sarah's lap, the casual entitlement in David's voice, the assumption that their word should be enough to override the family's clearly stated objections, it all combined to push him toward the edge of his carefully maintained control. "Don't matter what some gas station kid told you," Jesse said, his voice carrying a warning that made David's pulse quicken. "This ain't your land, ain't your road, and you ain't welcome here." Sarah felt a chill of real fear run down her spine. There was something in the younger man's eyes, a hardness that spoke of experiences she couldn't imagine. "David, maybe we should just turn around." But David's pride was stinging now. He was an educated, successful professional who'd never had trouble talking his way out of difficult situations. The idea that these mountain people could intimidate him felt like a challenge to everything he believed about himself. "Look, I understand this is your property," he said, his tone becoming more condescending than he intended. "But we're not doing any harm. We're just driving through. We'll be gone in 5 minutes. Surely there's no need to make a big deal out of this." The words hit Clayton like a physical blow. The casual dismissal of his rights, the assumption that the family's concerns were unreasonable, the entitled belief that convenience trumped ownership, it was everything he'd feared about the changing world, concentrated into one infuriating moment. "No harm," Clayton repeated, his voice deadly quiet. "You broke my gate chain. You're driving through my yard without permission. You're treating my family's home like a public playground. And you think that's no harm?" David felt the first stirring of real concern. These weren't the simple mountain folk he'd expected, grateful for a chance to meet sophisticated city people. These were angry property owners with legitimate grievances, and he was beginning to understand that his usual charm wasn't going to work. "I'm sorry about the gate," he said, attempting damage control. "We didn't realize. We can pay for any damage. This doesn't have to be a problem." Jesse laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Pay for it? You think this is about money?" He gestured toward the mountains that surrounded them, the family land that stretched in every direction. "You think you can just throw cash at people and make everything okay?" Martha watched the confrontation with growing alarm. She could see the situation escalating, could feel the anger building on both sides. The young couple clearly didn't understand what they'd walked into, but ignorance wasn't going to excuse their behavior much longer. "You need to leave," she said firmly, stepping between her son and the car. "Turn around and go back the way you came. There are plenty of public roads that'll get you where you're going." Sarah grabbed David's arm. "Please, let's just go. This isn't worth it." But David was caught between his wounded pride and his growing realization that they were genuinely unwelcome here. The smart thing to do was apologize and leave. But something in the Mountain family's attitude rankled him. In his world, problems were solved through negotiation and compromise. The absolute nature of their rejection felt unreasonable, almost primitive. "I understand you're upset," he said, trying one more time. "But we're reasonable people. Surely we can work something out that makes everyone happy." Jesse stepped closer to the car, his face inches from David's window. "Happy?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You want to make me happy? You want to work something out? Then get off my family's land before I do something we'll both regret." The threat was unmistakable, and suddenly David understood that this wasn't a negotiation. This was a warning, possibly the last one he was going to get. The reasonable thing to do was leave immediately, before the situation deteriorated further. But as he looked at Jesse's face, at the cold fury in his eyes, David felt something snap inside him. He'd never been threatened before, never had anyone speak to him with such naked hostility. His privileged upbringing had left him unprepared for situations where his education and social status counted for nothing. "Are you threatening us?" he asked, his voice rising in indignation. "Because if you are, I'll call the police. You can't just intimidate people because you don't like them driving through your neighborhood." The words hung in the mountain air like smoke from a wildfire, poisoning everything they touched. Jesse's face went white with rage, and for a moment Martha thought he might actually drag David from the car. Clayton grabbed his son's arm, but she could see that even her husband's legendary calm was beginning to crack. "Get out," Clayton said, his voice carrying a finality that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Get out now and don't ever come back. Next time, you won't get a warning." David wanted to argue, wanted to assert his rights as an American citizen, but the look in Clayton's eyes convinced him that discretion was indeed the better part of valor. He threw the car into reverse and began backing down the narrow road, his hands shaking with a mixture of fear and outrage. As the rental car disappeared around the curve, the Holloway family stood in their yard, breathing hard and staring at the dust cloud left in its wake. The confrontation had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. Something had shifted in that brief encounter. Some line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. "That's not the end of it," Jesse said quietly, his voice still carrying that dangerous flatness. "People like that don't give up easy. They'll be back or they'll send others." Martha nodded grimly. She'd seen the look in David's eyes as he drove away. Not fear, but anger. The kind of anger that festered and grew, that demanded satisfaction. They'd made an enemy today, whether they'd intended to or not. "Maybe it's time to call Thomas back," she said. "Tell him to forget about the sheriff. Seems like we're past the point where talking's going to help." Clayton looked down the empty road, his jaw clenched with determination. 130 years my family's been on this land. We survived the Civil War, the Depression, 2 world wars. We ain't going to be run off by a bunch of tourists who think they own the world. But even as he spoke, Clayton felt a cold certainty settling in his bones. The confrontation with the young couple was just the beginning. Word would spread, stories would be told, and more strangers would come looking for trouble. The question was no longer whether they could avoid conflict, but whether they could control it when it finally arrived. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily overhead, riding the thermal currents that rose from the sun-warmed mountains. From its high vantage point, the bird could see for miles in every direction. The winding dirt road, the cluster of buildings that marked the Holloway homestead, the ribbon of highway where David and Sarah's rental car was speeding toward town. If the hawk could have understood human affairs, it might have recognized the signs of a coming storm. But hawks concern themselves only with the immediate business of survival, leaving the complexities of human pride and territorial disputes to the earthbound creatures below. The mountain morning continued its slow progression toward afternoon, indifferent to the drama that had just unfolded in its shadows. But the seeds of something larger had been planted, and like all seeds in fertile ground, they would soon begin to grow. The Millfield Sheriff's Department occupied a squat brick building on Main Street, wedged between Ethel Carson's Five and Dime and a barbershop that had been cutting hair the same way since 1952. Thomas Holloway sat in the hard plastic chair across from Sheriff Roy Brennan's desk, his hat balanced on his knee and his patience wearing thin with each passing minute. Sheriff Brennan was a large man who'd grown larger over his 23 years in office, his uniform straining across a belly that spoke of too many church suppers and not enough exercise. He'd been born in these mountains, understood the old ways, but he also knew which way the political winds were blowing. Tourism meant tax revenue, and tax revenue meant job security. "Now, Thomas," Brennan said, leaning back in his creaking chair, "I understand your family's frustration. I really do. But you got to understand my position here. These tourists, they bring money into the county, money that pays for things like road maintenance, school improvements, my deputy's salary." Thomas felt his jaw clench. He'd known Roy Brennan since they were boys, had gone to school with him, had even dated his sister briefly in high school. But the man sitting across from him now seemed like a stranger, someone more concerned with politics than justice. "Roy, they're trespassing on private property," Thomas said, his voice carefully controlled. "They broke our gate, ignored our signs, treated us like we were invisible. That's not tourism, that's vandalism." Brennan sighed and shuffled through the papers on his desk, a gesture that Thomas recognized as stalling. "Look, I hear what you're saying, but technically, if folks don't see proper signage, if they've been told it's a public road, there's a question of intent. Now you put up some better signs, maybe get them surveyed and registered with the county, and then we can talk about enforcement." "Better signs." Thomas stood up, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "Roy, these people aren't getting lost. They're choosing to ignore us. They think because we're mountain folk our property rights don't matter." The sheriff's face flushed slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Now, I wouldn't go that far. But you got to admit, Thomas, your family's always been particular about outsiders. Maybe these folks just don't understand the local customs." Thomas stared at the man he'd once called friend, feeling something cold and hard settle in his chest. Local customs, like respecting private property, like asking permission before you drive through someone's yard. Those aren't local customs, Roy. Those are basic decency. Brennan stood up as well, his bulk making the small office feel even more cramped. "Look, I'll tell you what I can do. I'll have my deputy swing by your place more often, keep an eye out for trouble. But unless someone gets hurt or you can prove malicious intent, my hands are tied." "Unless someone gets hurt," Thomas repeated slowly. "That's what it's going to take. Someone has to get hurt before you'll do your job." The words hung between them like a challenge, and for a moment, Thomas saw something flicker in Brennan's eyes, recognition maybe, of how far they'd both come from the boys who'd once fished together in Mill Creek. But the moment passed, and the sheriff's professional mask slipped back into place. "I'm doing my job, Thomas, but my job includes keeping the peace for everyone in this county, not just the Holloways. You go home, talk to your family, and figure out a way to work with these tourists instead of against them. Maybe there's an opportunity here you haven't considered." Thomas felt the last of his faith in official channels die in that moment. He put his hat on his head and walked toward the door, then turned back one final time. "You know what, Roy? When this blows up, and it will blow up, you remember this conversation. You remember that you had a chance to stop it before it got ugly." The sheriff's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "That sounds like a threat, Thomas." "No," Thomas replied quietly. "That's a prediction, and coming from someone who's known these mountains his whole life, you might want to take it serious." Meanwhile, 50 miles away in the city of Lexington, David Mitchell sat in his apartment, scrolling through Google searches on his laptop, while Sarah paced the living room behind him. They'd driven straight through after their encounter with the Holloway family, neither of them speaking much during the 3-hour trip back to civilization. "Look at this," David said, pointing at his screen. "According to the county records, the Holloway family does own that land. All 500 acres of it going back to 1847. Sarah stopped pacing and looked over his shoulder. "So we were trespassing?" "Technically, yes, but look at this other stuff I found." David's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up articles from tourism websites and travel blogs. There are at least a dozen sites that mention that road as a hidden gem and authentic mountain experience. Someone even posted GPS coordinates. Sarah sank into the couch beside him, her face troubled. "David, that doesn't make it right. If it's their land, it's their land. We were wrong to be there." But David was deep into what Sarah recognized as one of his problem-solving modes, the mental state that made him successful in advertising, but sometimes blind to simpler truths. Think about it, though. This could actually be a win-win situation. These people are sitting on a tourism goldmine, but they don't know how to monetize it. We could help them. "Monetize it?" Sarah's voice carried a note of disbelief. "David, did you see the look in that man's eyes? He didn't want to monetize anything. He wanted us gone." David turned to face her, his expression earnest and animated. "That's because they don't understand the opportunity. We're talking about authentic Appalachian culture, real mountain life, the kind of experience that money can't buy. Do you know how much people would pay for that?" Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. She'd seen David like this before, convinced that every problem had a solution if you just applied enough creativity and persistence. But some problems weren't meant to be solved. They were meant to be respected. "Maybe," she said carefully, "the fact that money can't buy it is exactly why they don't want to sell it." Back in the mountains, Thomas pulled his pickup truck into the Holloway driveway just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks. The familiar sight of home, the cabin with smoke rising from its chimney, his mother's garden with its neat rows of late vegetables, his father's workshop with tools arranged just so, should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like a fortress under siege. Clayton and Jesse emerged from the barn as Thomas climbed out of his truck, their faces expectant. Martha appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression already showing that she knew the news wasn't good. "Let me guess," Jesse said before Thomas could speak. "Sheriff Brennan's got more important things to worry about than mountain folk and their property rights." Thomas nodded grimly. "Says we need better signage. Says unless someone gets hurt, there's not much he can do. Says maybe we should consider working with the tourists instead of against them." Clayton's face went dark as a thundercloud. "Working with them? What's that supposed to mean?" "I think it means Roy Brennan's forgot where he comes from," Martha said quietly from the porch. "Thinks maybe if he plays nice with the tourism folks, it'll help his re-election chances." Jesse kicked at the gravel, his anger barely contained. "So that's it? We're supposed to just smile and wave while strangers tromp through our yard? Maybe put up a little stand, sell them lemonade and souvenirs?" "That's about the size of it," Thomas confirmed. "Roy made it pretty clear that tourism dollars talk louder than property rights these days." The family stood in silence for a moment, each of them processing what this meant. For generations, the Holloways had lived by a simple code: work hard, respect your neighbors, and defend what's yours. Now they were being told that the first two no longer guaranteed the third. "Well," Clayton said finally, his voice carrying a note of finality that his family recognized, "I guess that settles it." Martha looked at her husband with concern. "Settles what, Clayton?" "Settles the question of whether we can count on outside help. Answer is no, we can't. Which means we handle this ourselves the way mountain folk always have." Jesse straightened up, something dangerous flickering in his eyes. "What did you have in mind, Daddy?" Clayton walked over to his workshop and emerged with a heavy sledgehammer and a box of metal fence posts. "We're going to make our property lines crystal clear. Posts every 50 feet, signs that even a city fool couldn't miss. And if that doesn't work..." He let the sentence hang unfinished, but the implication was clear to everyone present. The Holloways had reached the end of their patience with official channels and polite requests. Whatever came next would be on their own terms. Thomas felt a knot of worry form in his stomach. "Daddy, we need to be careful here. Sheriff Brennan might not be much help, but he's still the law. We do something stupid, and we'll be the ones in trouble." "Stupid?" Clayton's voice carried an edge his family rarely heard. "Son, what's stupid is expecting other people to respect what we won't defend ourselves. My daddy didn't ask permission to settle this land, and my granddaddy didn't ask permission to keep it. I'll be damned if I'm going to be the first Holloway to give it up without a fight." Martha watched her husband and sons with growing alarm. She'd seen men in the mountains reach this point before, seen what happened when pride and frustration overcame common sense. It never ended well for anyone involved. "Maybe we should think about this more," she suggested. "Sleep on it, talk it through in the morning when we're all calmer." Jesse shook his head. "Mama, thinking time is over. Every day we wait, more people hear about our road. Every day we don't act, we look weaker. Sometimes you got to draw a line in the sand and dare people to cross it." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of an approaching engine drifted up from the valley. All 4 Holloways turned toward the road, tension radiating from them like heat from a fire. Another car was coming, another test of their resolve, but this time it wasn't tourists or trespassers. A familiar blue pickup truck rounded the curve, moving slowly and respectfully up the mountain road. Jimmy Patterson from the general store climbed out, his face grave with the weight of unwelcome news. "Evening, folks," Jimmy said, touching the brim of his baseball cap. "Sorry to bother you, but I thought you ought to know what's been happening in town." Clayton stepped forward. "What kind of happening?" Jimmy glanced around at the family, clearly uncomfortable with his role as messenger. "Had some folks in the store this afternoon, city folks, asking a lot of questions about your road. Seemed real interested in the history of the area, who owned what land, that sort of thing." "What kind of folks?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Young couple, Tennessee plates on their car. Said they'd been through here earlier, had some kind of misunderstanding with you all. Wanted to know about property lines, public access rights, that kind of legal stuff." Martha felt her heart sink. "Did they say what they were planning to do?" Jimmy shook his head. "Not exactly, but they were asking about lawyers, about who to contact at the county courthouse, and they weren't asking like people who were planning to drop the matter." Jesse's hands clenched into fists. "They're going to try to cause us legal trouble, probably claim we threatened them or something." "There's more," Jimmy continued reluctantly. "They also asked about local media, newspapers, maybe TV stations. Said something about this being a story that people needed to hear about. The implications hit the family like a physical blow. Bad enough that strangers were trespassing on their land, but the idea of their private business being splashed across newspapers and television screens was almost unbearable. The Holloways had always valued their privacy, their right to live their lives away from outside scrutiny. "Media?" Martha's voice was barely a whisper. "They want to put us on TV?" Clayton's face had gone white with rage. "They want to make a spectacle out of us. Turn us into some kind of curiosity for people to gawk at." Thomas felt the situation spiraling beyond anyone's control. "Jimmy, did they say anything else? Anything about when they might be back?" The storekeeper shook his head. "Not specifically, but they bought a road map and asked about motels in the area. Seemed like they were planning to stick around for a while." After Jimmy left, the Holloway family gathered on their porch as the sun set behind the mountains. The familiar sounds of evening, crickets chirping, cattle lowing in the distance, the whisper of wind through pine trees, should have been comforting. Instead, they felt like the soundtrack to a way of life under siege. "They're not going to give up," Jesse said, voicing what everyone was thinking. "People like that, they think they can solve any problem by throwing lawyers and media attention at it. They don't understand that some things aren't for sale." Martha rocked slowly in her chair, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. "Maybe we should call Cousin Billy." He's a lawyer down in Frankfurt. Might be able to help us understand our rights." Clayton shook his head. "Billy's a good boy, but this isn't about legal rights anymore. This is about something deeper. These people don't just want to use our road. They want to change us, make us into something we're not." Thomas looked at his family, seeing the same determination in each face that had sustained the Holloways through generations of hardship. But he also saw something else, a hardening, a closing off from the outside world that worried him deeply. "We have to be smart about this," he said. "Whatever we do, we can't give them ammunition to use against us. Can't look like the crazy mountain folk they probably think we are." Jesse turned to his brother, his eyes reflecting the last light of the setting sun. "Maybe the problem isn't what they think about us, Thomas. Maybe the problem is that we've been caring too much about what outsiders think, trying to fit into their idea of reasonable behavior." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means maybe it's time to remind people why mountain folk have always been left alone. Not because we're friendly and accommodating, but because we're not people you want to mess with." Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October evening. "Jesse, you're talking about intimidation. Maybe worse." Her younger son looked at her with eyes that seemed older than his 35 years. "I'm talking about survival, Mama. About protecting what's ours before it gets taken away by people who think we don't deserve it." Clayton stood up slowly, his decision made. "Tomorrow morning we start putting up new fence posts, big ones with signs that can't be missed or ignored. We make it clear that this is private property and trespassers aren't welcome." "And if they come anyway?" Thomas asked. His father's smile was cold as winter morning. "Then they'll learn why their grandparents had enough sense to leave mountain folk alone." As the family prepared for bed that night, none of them slept easily. Martha lay awake listening to Clayton's breathing, wondering if they were making the right choices or simply reacting out of wounded pride. Thomas stared at the ceiling of his old bedroom, thinking about his wife and children and what kind of world he was helping to create for them. And Jesse walked the property lines in the darkness, his military training alive in his movements, already thinking like a man preparing for war. Meanwhile, 60 miles away in a Lexington motel, David Mitchell sat at a small table with his laptop open and his phone pressed to his ear. He was talking to his friend Marcus Webb, an investigative journalist who specialized in human interest stories for a regional newspaper. "I'm telling you, Marcus, this is exactly the kind of story your readers would eat up," David was saying. "Isolated mountain family terrorizing innocent tourists, claiming ownership of what should be public land. It's got everything. Class conflict, regional stereotypes, David versus Goliath dynamics." On the other end of the line, Marcus was taking notes. "And you say they actually threatened you?" David hesitated for just a moment. The truth was that the Holloways had told them to leave, but hadn't actually made specific threats. But the feeling of menace had been real, the sense that violence was just below the surface of their mountain politeness. "They made it very clear that we weren't welcome," he said finally. "The younger son especially, there was something dangerous about him, like he'd done violence before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again." Sarah, who was lying on the motel bed pretending to read, felt her stomach clench at her boyfriend's words. She'd been there for the encounter, had seen and heard everything David had. And while the mountain family had certainly been unwelcoming, she couldn't honestly say they'd been threatening in the way David was implying. "David," she said quietly, "that's not exactly what happened." He covered the phone with his hand and looked at her sharply. "Sarah, they basically ran us off at gunpoint. They didn't have guns. And they didn't threaten us. They just told us to leave their property." David's face flushed with irritation. "Whose side are you on here? These people humiliated us, treated us like criminals for taking a shortcut. Don't you think that's worth calling out?" Sarah sat up on the bed, suddenly understanding that this had become about much more than a simple misunderstanding on a mountain road. For David, it had become a matter of principle, a battle between his vision of modern, reasonable society and what he saw as backward mountain provincialism. "I think," she said carefully, "that maybe we should just let this go. We made a mistake, they corrected us, and now we know better. Why does it have to be more complicated than that?" But David was already back on the phone with Marcus, his voice animated with the excitement of someone who'd found a cause worth fighting for. The thing is, this isn't just about us. How many other people have been intimidated by this family? How many potential visitors have been scared away from experiencing authentic Appalachian culture because of these self-appointed gatekeepers? Sarah lay back down and closed her eyes, feeling the situation slipping beyond any hope of reasonable resolution. In the morning, she knew Marcus Webb would begin making phone calls, researching property records, and planning a story that would change everything for everyone involved. And once that story was published, there would be no going back for any of them. Outside the motel window, the lights of Lexington twinkled in the valley below, a constellation of modern life that felt a million miles away from the dark mountains where the Holloway family was preparing for a battle they never wanted, but increasingly felt they couldn't avoid. The stage was set, the lines were drawn, and the morning would bring choices that would echo through the mountains for years to come. In the space between sleeping and waking, between the old ways and the new, something was about to break that could never be repaired. The mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what their human inhabitants would do with the gift of dawn. The October sun rose blood red over the Appalachian ridges, painting the morning mist the color of old wounds. Clayton Holloway stood in his yard with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, watching his sons drive metal fence posts into the rocky soil with the methodical precision of men who understood that some lines, once drawn, could never be erased. Thomas swung the sledgehammer with steady, powerful strokes, each impact driving the galvanized steel deeper into the mountain earth. Beside him, Jesse held each post steady, his face a mask of concentration that barely contained the storm building behind his eyes. They'd been at it since dawn, working their way along the property line that bordered the disputed road, and the pile of posts was dwindling as their fence of determination grew. "That's the last one for this section," Thomas said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the morning chill. Each post stood 8 feet tall, topped with a reflective metal sign that read, "Private property, Holloway family land. Trespassers will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law." The letters were large enough to read from a moving car, painted in bright red, that would be visible even in poor weather. Martha emerged from the cabin carrying a thermos of fresh coffee and a plate of biscuits wrapped in a checkered towel. She moved with the efficient grace of a woman who'd been taking care of her family for 4 decades, but Thomas could see the worry lines that had deepened around her eyes in recent days. "You boys need to eat something," she said, setting the food on the tailgate of Thomas's pickup. "Can't work on empty stomachs." Jesse straightened up and accepted a biscuit, but his attention was focused on the road below. "Mama, we got company coming." A white sedan with rental car plates was making its way slowly up the mountain road, moving with the careful deliberation of someone unfamiliar with the terrain. But this wasn't the same car that had brought David and Sarah Mitchell. This one carried strangers, and strangers meant trouble of a different kind. Clayton set down his coffee cup and walked to the edge of the yard, his family falling in behind him with the unconscious coordination of people who'd faced threats together before. The car stopped at the newly installed gate, a heavy steel barrier that Jesse had welded together the night before, complete with a lock that could stop anything short of a bulldozer. 2 people climbed out of the sedan, a middle-aged man in khakis and a polo shirt who moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way, and a younger woman carrying a professional camera and notebook. Even at a distance, the Holloways could see the press credentials hanging from lanyards around their necks. "Marcus Webb, Lexington Herald Leader," the man called out, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone used to opening doors with his credentials. "I'm working on a story about tourism access and property rights in Appalachia. I was hoping we could talk." Thomas felt his stomach drop. This was what Jimmy Patterson had warned them about. The city folks had made good on their threat to bring media attention to the situation. Once newspaper people got involved, everything became public. Everything became a spectacle for outsiders to judge and dissect. "We got nothing to say to reporters," Clayton called back, his voice carrying across the morning air with unmistakable finality. "This is private property, and you're not welcome here." Marcus Webb smiled the patient smile of someone who'd encountered reluctant interview subjects before. "Mr. Holloway, I understand your concern about privacy, but this is really a larger story about how rural communities balance traditional land rights with modern tourism needs. Your perspective would be valuable to our readers." Jesse stepped forward, his jaw clenched with barely controlled anger. "Your readers? You mean people who want to gawk at us like we're animals in a zoo? People who think mountain folk are backwards and need to be educated about the modern world?" The reporter's smile faltered slightly. "That's not at all what this is about. We're interested in presenting a fair and balanced look at both sides of this issue. Tourism brings economic opportunities to rural areas, but it also creates challenges for traditional landowners. It's a complex story that deserves thoughtful coverage." Martha felt a flash of fury at the man's condescending tone. "Complex story? There's nothing complex about it. This is our land, has been for 4 generations. We don't want strangers driving through our yard. And we got every right to say no, end of story." The photographer, a young woman who looked fresh out of college, raised her camera and began snapping pictures of the family and their property. The sound of the camera's shutter clicked like an insect in the morning silence, and Jesse's hands clenched into fists. "Put that camera down," he said, his voice carrying a warning that made the photographer take a step backward. "You don't have permission to photograph our property." Marcus Webb held up his hands in a gesture meant to be calming. "We're on a public road, which means we have the right to photograph what's visible from here. But we're not trying to cause problems. We just want to understand your position and share it fairly with our readers." Thomas looked at the reporter with growing disgust. "Fair? You call it fair when you show up uninvited, start taking pictures without permission, and act like you've got some God-given right to put our private business in your newspaper?" "The public has a right to know about issues that affect public policy," Webb replied, his professional mask beginning to slip. "Property rights, tourism development, rural economic opportunity, these are matters of legitimate public interest." Clayton had heard enough. "Get off my land," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an undertone that made the hair on the back of Webb's neck stand up. "Take your camera, take your notebook and get out, don't come back." But Marcus Webb had spent 20 years covering stories in rural Kentucky, and he recognized the signs of a situation about to spiral out of control. This wasn't just about trespassing anymore. This was about people who felt cornered, who saw their way of life under attack. In his experience, that's when mountain folk became dangerous. "I understand you're upset," he said, pulling out his business card. "But this story is going to be written with or without your cooperation. Wouldn't you rather have your side of it told accurately?" Jesse moved toward the gate with the fluid, predatory motion of someone who'd been trained to violence. "You threatening us? You saying you're going to write lies about us if we don't talk?" The photographer had stopped taking pictures and was backing toward the car, her professional instincts warring with her growing sense that this situation was about to turn dangerous. "Marcus, maybe we should go—" But Webb was caught up in the momentum of his story, convinced that he was dealing with exactly the kind of backwards mountain thinking that his urban readers expected. "I'm not threatening anyone. I'm simply pointing out that this is a story of legitimate public interest. Your family has been intimidating tourists, claiming ownership of what appears to be a traditional public right-of-way." "Appears to be." Thomas's voice cracked like a whip. "You calling us liars about our own land?" Martha stepped between her son and the reporter, recognizing the signs that meant violence was about to erupt. "You need to leave, now, before this gets out of hand." Webb looked at the assembled family, 4 people standing in their own yard, defending their own property, but somehow transformed by his presence into something that felt primitive and threatening. The cognitive dissonance was lost on him. In his mind, he was the reasonable voice of modernity confronting irrational resistance to progress. "This conversation will be part of my story," he said, climbing back into his car. "The public deserves to know how visitors to this region are being treated." As the white sedan disappeared down the mountain road, the Holloway family stood in their yard, feeling something fundamental shift in their world. This wasn't about trespassing anymore, or even about property rights. This was about their very identity being put on trial in the court of public opinion. "They're going to make us out to be the villains," Thomas said quietly. "Crazy mountain folk terrorizing innocent tourists." Jesse kicked at the gravel, his face dark with rage. "Let them. Maybe it's time people remembered that mountain folk aren't to be trifled with." Martha looked at her younger son with growing alarm. "Jesse, what are you thinking?" I'm thinking that we tried doing this the polite way and it didn't work. We tried doing it the legal way, and the sheriff won't help us. Now they want to drag us through the newspapers, make us out to be the bad guys for defending our own land." His voice carried a flatness that his family recognized and feared. Maybe it's time to give them something real to write about. Clayton studied his son's face, seeing echoes of the boy who'd left for Vietnam and shadows of the man who'd returned. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that if people are going to call us dangerous mountain folk anyway, maybe we should start acting like it. Give them a reason to stay away that has nothing to do with politeness or property rights." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "Jesse, you're talking about escalation. You do something to hurt somebody, and we'll all end up in prison." "Better than ending up as tourist attractions," Jesse replied. "Better than having our home turned into a theme park for city folk who want to gawk at authentic mountain culture." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of another approaching vehicle, this one moving much faster than the reporter's careful pace. A familiar pickup truck came roaring up the mountain road, throwing gravel and trailing a cloud of dust. The truck belonged to Danny Patterson, Jimmy's younger brother, and the speed of his approach meant he was bringing news that couldn't wait. Danny skidded to a stop in the Holloway yard and jumped out of his truck, his face flushed with excitement and something that might have been fear. At 25, he was young enough to still find drama exciting, but old enough to understand when that drama might have serious consequences. "Mr. Holloway," he called out breathlessly, "you need to know what's happening in town. That reporter fellow, he's been talking to everyone, asking questions about your family, about this road, about how long you've been here." Clayton's face remained impassive, but Martha could see the muscle in his jaw twitching. "What kind of questions?" "Questions about whether you all have always been difficult to deal with, about other times when you've had trouble with outsiders. He's been asking about Jesse specifically, about his time in the army, about whether he's ever been violent." Jesse's face went white with rage. "He's trying to paint me as some kind of unstable veteran, isn't he? Crazy mountain man who might snap at any moment." Danny nodded reluctantly. "That's kind of how it sounded. And there's more. He's not the only one asking questions. There's been other folks in town today, folks with cameras and notebooks. Word's gotten out somehow, and now everybody wants to know about the Holloway family and their private road." Martha felt the world tilting around her. This morning, they'd been a family dealing with a property dispute. Now they were apparently the subject of a media circus, with strangers dissecting their lives and motivations for public consumption. "How many reporters?" Thomas asked. "I counted at least 3 different cars with out-of-state plates. And I heard someone mention something about a TV crew coming up from Lexington this afternoon." The words hit the family like physical blows. Television meant cameras, meant their faces and their home broadcast into living rooms across the region. It meant being turned into symbols instead of people, caricatures instead of human beings with legitimate concerns. "They're going to destroy us," Martha said quietly. "Turn us into cartoon villains so people can feel good about taking what's ours." Clayton looked around at his family, his property, his life's work. Everything he'd built, everything he'd inherited, everything he'd hoped to pass on to his grandchildren was about to be trampled by a media stampede that would leave nothing recognizable in its wake. "Maybe," he said finally, "or maybe it's time to remind people why their ancestors left mountain folk alone." Jesse straightened up, understanding passing between father and son like an electric current. "What do you want me to do, Daddy?" "I want you to make sure that anyone who comes up that road without permission understands that they're not welcome. I want you to make it clear that this isn't a game, and we're not entertainment for bored city folk." Thomas felt panic rising in his chest. "Daddy, you're talking about intimidating reporters. That's a federal crime. They'll have the FBI up here before sundown." Clayton's smile was cold as a winter creek. "Only if they can prove we broke the law. Far as I know, standing on your own property and telling trespassers to leave isn't illegal yet." Martha looked at her husband and younger son, seeing something in their faces that frightened her more than all the reporters and cameras in the world. "Clayton, what exactly are you planning?" "I'm planning to protect what's mine," he said simply. "Same as my daddy did, and his daddy before him. Mountain folk have always understood that some things are worth fighting for, and this is one of them. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of multiple vehicles could be heard approaching from the valley below. The media circus that Danny had warned them about was arriving in force, and the Holloway family's private struggle was about to become a public spectacle. Jesse walked to the gun cabinet in the cabin and emerged with a hunting rifle, checking the load with practiced efficiency. "Daddy's right," he said quietly. "Time to make a stand." Martha watched her son with growing horror, but she also felt a fierce pride in his determination to defend their home. "Jesse, you be careful. These aren't enemy soldiers, they're just people doing their jobs." "People doing their jobs by destroying our lives," Jesse replied. "Seems to me that makes them enemies enough." The first TV truck crested the hill, its satellite dish gleaming in the afternoon sun like a technological predator. Behind it came cars and trucks carrying reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers drawn by the promise of authentic mountain drama. Clayton Holloway stood in his yard, surrounded by his family, and watching strangers invade the place he'd called home for 67 years. The fence posts he'd spent the morning installing suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate against this new kind of trespass, this violation of privacy disguised as public interest. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly to his family, "we stick together. We protect what's ours, and we don't let these outsiders make us ashamed of who we are." Thomas looked at his father, his brother, his mother, and felt the weight of 4 generations of mountain pride settling on his shoulders. There was no going back now, no peaceful resolution that would satisfy everyone involved. The outside world had decided that the Holloway family's private business was public entertainment, and now they would all have to live with the consequences. The TV truck stopped at the locked gate, its occupants climbing out with the confident efficiency of people accustomed to access. Behind them, more vehicles were arriving, creating a traffic jam on the narrow mountain road. Reporters were setting up cameras, photographers were choosing angles, and the quiet hollow that had been home to 4 generations of Holloways was about to become the center of a media storm that would change everything forever. Jesse chambered around in his hunting rifle, the metallic sound echoing across the yard like a declaration of war. "Let them come," he said quietly. "Let them all come, and we'll show them what mountain justice looks like." Martha closed her eyes and prayed to a God who'd watched over mountain folk for generations, asking for wisdom and protection for her family in the dark hours that she could feel approaching like storm clouds over the peaks. The morning had begun with fence posts and property signs, but as the sun reached its zenith over the Appalachian ridges, she suspected it might end with something that none of them could take back. The mountains themselves seemed to lean in closer, as if seeking to shelter the people who'd made their peace with isolation and independence. But there was no shelter from what was coming, no hiding place from the judgment of a world that had decided the old ways were obstacles to progress. In the gathering crowd below, Marcus Webb was setting up his camera equipment and preparing to go live with a story about backward mountain folk threatening innocent tourists. 60 miles away, David Mitchell was watching the early news coverage with satisfaction, convinced that justice was finally being served. And somewhere in the hollow between competing versions of truth, something precious and irreplaceable was about to be lost forever. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through these mountains long after the reporters went home and the cameras stopped rolling. The only question was how many people would be broken in the process, and whether anything recognizable would remain when the dust finally settled. Jesse Holloway stood at the edge of his family's property, rifle in hand and determination in his heart, watching strangers prepare to judge his life and find it wanting. But he was a mountain man, heir to generations of people who'd chosen hard independence over easy compromise, and he was prepared to pay whatever price that heritage demanded. The mountains watched and waited, patient as stone, knowing that human storms passed but the land endured forever. As the afternoon wore on, more vehicles arrived, creating a traffic jam that stretched back to the main highway. News crews from 3 different stations had set up their equipment, reporters were doing stand-up reports against the backdrop of the Holloway property, and curious onlookers were parking wherever they could find space. The scene had taken on the atmosphere of a bizarre festival, with vendors appearing as if from nowhere, to sell coffee and sandwiches to the growing crowd. Someone had even brought folding chairs, settling in to watch the drama unfold as if it were a form of entertainment. From their position behind the locked gate, the Holloway family watched the circus with growing disbelief and rage. Their private pain had become public spectacle, their legitimate grievances transformed into content for the 24-hour news cycle. "Look at them," Thomas said, his voice heavy with disgust. "It's like a county fair, except we're the freak show." Martha had retreated to the porch, unable to watch any longer as strangers dissected her family's life for public consumption. 43 years I've lived in this house," she said quietly. "Raised 3 children, buried my parents, watched the seasons change from this porch, and now it's all going to be reduced to a sound bite for the evening news." Clayton joined his wife on the porch, settling heavily into his chair as if the weight of the situation was physically crushing him. "Martha, I'm sorry. I never meant for it to come to this." She reached over and took his weathered hand in hers, feeling the calluses from a lifetime of honest work. "I did what any man would do, defending his home and family. It's not your fault that the world's gone crazy." Below them, they could see Jesse moving along the fence line, his rifle visible but not threatening, making sure that none of the reporters or cameras crossed onto Holloway land. His movements were controlled and purposeful, but Martha could see the tension in his shoulders, the coiled energy of a man approaching his breaking point. "I'm worried about Jesse," she said quietly. "He's been different since he got back from the war, and this situation, it's pushing him towards something dark." Clayton nodded grimly. "Boy's got demons, that's for sure. But he's also got more reason than most to understand what we're fighting for. He went overseas to protect American freedoms, and now he comes home to find that freedom doesn't extend to mountain folk who want to be left alone." A commotion near the gate drew their attention. One of the reporters, apparently frustrated by the family's refusal to be interviewed, had decided to test the boundaries. He'd climbed over the gate and was walking up the road toward the house, camera crew following behind him. Jesse appeared as if from nowhere, stepping into the reporter's path with his rifle held across his chest. The 2 men faced each other in the dusty road, representing 2 different worlds that seemed incapable of understanding each other. "This is private property," Jesse said, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "You need to turn around and go back where you came from." The reporter, a young man with perfectly styled hair and expensive clothes, smiled with the confidence of someone who'd never been truly threatened. "Sir, I'm Jim Bradley from Channel 12 News. We're doing a story about property rights and tourism access. I just have a few questions." "I don't care if you're the President of the United States," Jesse interrupted. "You're trespassing and you need to leave, now." Bradley's camera operator continued filming, and the reporter seemed to sense that he was getting exactly the kind of dramatic footage his viewers expected. "Sir, are you threatening me? Because that would be a serious crime." Something snapped behind Jesse's eyes, and suddenly he wasn't a mountain man protecting his family's property anymore. He was a soldier in hostile territory, surrounded by enemies who threatened everything he held dear. The rifle came up to his shoulder in one smooth motion, the barrel pointing directly at the reporter's chest. "I said, get off our land," Jesse said, his voice flat and deadly. "Don't make me say it again." The scene froze like a photograph, capturing a moment that would define everything that came after. Camera crews scrambled to get the best angle. Reporters started talking breathlessly into their microphones, and someone in the crowd screamed. Bradley raised his hands and began backing away, his professional composure finally cracking. Okay, I'm leaving. Nobody needs to get hurt here." But the damage was done. In the space of 30 seconds, Jesse Holloway had transformed from a property owner defending his rights into exactly the kind of dangerous mountain stereotype that the media had been looking for. The footage would be broadcast across the region within hours, cementing the narrative that had been building since Marcus Webb's first phone call. Clayton ran down from the porch, his heart pounding with a mixture of pride and terror. "Jesse, put the rifle down. You made your point." Jesse slowly lowered the weapon, but his eyes never left the retreating reporter. "Did I, Daddy? Because it seems to me like they're still here, still treating our home like their personal entertainment center." Thomas joined them, looking around at the chaos they'd unleashed. This is going to be on every news station in 3 states before dinner time. Jesse, what were you thinking? I was thinking that maybe if we show them we're serious, they'll finally leave us alone, Jesse replied. But even as he spoke, he could see the excited faces in the crowd below, the way the camera crews were positioning themselves for better shots. Instead of driving the media away, his actions had given them exactly what they were looking for. Martha appeared at Clayton's side, her face pale but determined. "Boys, we need to get inside. This has gone too far, and staying out here is just going to make it worse." But it was too late for retreat. The story had taken on a life of its own, and the Holloway family found themselves trapped in a narrative they couldn't control. Within hours, the footage of Jesse threatening a reporter would be viral, shared across social media with captions about crazy mountain folk and rural terrorism. As the family retreated to their cabin, they could hear the crowd below buzzing with excitement. What had started as a simple property dispute had become a symbol of everything urban America feared and misunderstood about rural life. The Holloways had become characters in a story written by people who'd never walked a mountain trail or worked land with their hands. Inside the cabin, they sat around the kitchen table that had been built by Clayton's grandfather, trying to process what their lives had become. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the media circus, the constant chatter of reporters doing live updates, the hum of generators powering television equipment. "We can't stay here," Thomas said finally. "Not with this circus going on. Maybe we should pack up, go stay with Cousin Billy in Frankfurt until this blows over." Jesse shook his head violently. "Run away? Let them drive us out of our own home? That's exactly what they want. For us to disappear so they can turn this place into a tourist attraction." "Better than ending up in federal prison," Thomas shot back. "You pointed a rifle at a news reporter, Jesse. That's assault with a deadly weapon, maybe terrorism charges depending on how they want to spin it." Martha looked around the kitchen where she'd cooked thousands of meals, where her children had done homework, and her grandchildren had played with wooden toys carved by their grandfather. The idea of abandoning it all felt like surrendering everything that mattered. "This is our home," she said quietly. 4 generations of Holloways are buried in the cemetery up the hill. We can't just walk away because a bunch of strangers decided our lives are their entertainment." Clayton stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the circus that had taken over his peaceful valley. "Martha's right. Running won't solve anything. It'll just confirm everything they want to believe about us." "So, what do we do?" Thomas asked. "The FBI is probably already on their way. Local law enforcement won't help us. The media has made us into villains. What options do we have left?" Jesse cleaned his rifle with methodical precision, his movements calm despite the chaos surrounding them. "We do what mountain folk have always done when outsiders threaten what's ours. We make sure they understand that some places, some people, aren't worth the trouble of messing with." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Outside, the media circus continued to grow, fed by a story that confirmed every stereotype about rural America and the supposed backwardness of people who chose independence over integration. But inside the cabin, 4 people who'd never asked for fame or notoriety prepared to make choices that would echo through these mountains for generations to come. The old ways and the new world had collided on a dirt road in eastern Kentucky, and nobody was going to escape unchanged. As darkness fell over the Appalachian ridges, the Holloway family faced the longest night of their lives, knowing that whatever came with the morning would determine not just their fate, but the fate of a way of life that had endured in these mountains since before America was born. The mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see whether their children would survive the storm that had been building since the first stranger decided that mountain privacy was a luxury the modern world couldn't afford.